The morning Clara Whitmore's life changed, she was on her knees in the mud behind Hattie Drummond's boarding house, scrubbing the iron pots that the breakfast cook refused to touch. It was barely past 6. The sky above Red Hollow was the color of old pewter, low and flat, pressing down on the rooftops like something tired of holding itself up. The wind came off the ridge in short, mean gusts that smelled of wet sage and cattle. Clara's hands were red from the lye soap and the cold water bath, and her back had been aching since she crawled out of her cot at 4:30 to haul firewood up from the yard. She didn't complain. There was nobody to complain to, and even if there were, she'd learned a long time ago that complaining only gave people more to say about her. Red Hollow was not a large town. It sat in a shallow valley between two ridgelines, the kind of place travelers passed through without stopping if they had any other choice. There was a general store, a livery, a saloon that changed names every time it changed owners, a small schoolhouse that was only half used, and Drummond's boarding house, which was the closest thing the town had to a social center. Hattie Drummond ran it with the efficiency of a woman who had learned early that softness cost money. She was not cruel exactly. She was practical, and practicality, in her case, looked a great deal like cruelty. Clara had worked at the boarding house for 3 years. She did the washing, the hauling, the scrubbing, the mending, and whatever else nobody else wanted to do. She was paid a small wage and given a room in the back that was more of a converted storage closet than anything deserving the word room, narrow enough that she had to turn sideways to get to her cot, with a single window too high to see out of unless she stood on the wooden crate she kept beneath it. She was 26 years old. She was not small. She was not the kind of woman that Red Hollow rewarded with kindness. That was the plain truth of it, and Clara had spent enough years sitting with that truth that it no longer burned the way it once had. It had settled into something duller, a low and constant pressure behind her sternum, like a stone she'd swallowed and couldn't pass. She was heavy in the way that made the town's women sniff and cut their eyes. Her clothes never fit right because she made them herself from whatever fabric she could piece together. Her hair was the medium brown of creek mud, and she wore it pinned back practically, not prettily. She had a strong jaw and steady eyes and hands that were permanently roughened from work. She was not the woman men looked at when they came into town. She was the woman they handed their dirty dishes to. She knew it. She'd known it since she was 12 years old and realized that the way people looked at her, or rather, the way they looked past her, was not going to change. So she worked. That was the thing Clara Whitmore was, a worker. She was still scrubbing when she heard the voices coming around the side of the building. There were 3 of them, Nora Hale, Bess Calder, and Louisa Fitch, the daughter of the man who owned the grain supply. They were all in their early 20s, all dressed better than Clara would ever dress, all carrying that particular brand of idleness that came with having fathers and brothers and husbands who handled the serious problems of life. They were not bad women, maybe, but they were bored, and boredom in small towns has a way of making people mean without them ever quite noticing it happening. Clara heard her name before she could decide whether to keep her head down or look up. "She's right there," Nora said, in a voice that made no effort to be quiet. "Back in the mud where she belongs." Clara set her brush down and sat up on her heels. She looked at them directly. She had learned that looking away only made it worse. "Morning," she said. Louisa smiled. It was the particular kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes, the kind that was really just a frame for whatever unpleasant thing was about to come out of the mouth. "Clara, you look busy." "I am busy." "Well, we might have some news that'd interest you." Louisa glanced at the others, that smile still fixed in place. "You know Sawyer Kane's been looking for someone to take the housekeeping work out at his ranch?" Clara did know it. Everyone in Red Hollow knew it because the last 3 people who'd taken that job had quit within a week. Sawyer Kane's ranch, the Broke Spur, people called it, though the official name on the deed was something more formal that nobody used, sat 8 miles northeast of town on a stretch of high grass that was either beautiful or desolate depending on your state of mind. The ranch itself was profitable enough. Sawyer ran cattle and knew how to work land. But he was not a man anyone sought out voluntarily. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been hardened by weather, and something else harder to name. He came to town only when he had to, said as little as possible when he did, and had a look in his eyes that made people give him a wide berth on the sidewalk. There were stories about his temper, There were stories about why his ranch house was falling into disrepair, despite the fact that he clearly had money enough to fix it. Nobody knew which of the stories were true, but collectively they added up to a portrait of a man you didn't go looking for trouble with. Clara had seen him twice. Both times he'd looked straight through her, which was more or less what everyone did. "I heard," Clara said. She picked her brush back up. "Hattie was going to post the notice in the store tomorrow," Louisa said. "But we thought, well, Clara, you're always saying you want more work." "I don't say that. You look like someone who could use it." Nora's voice had that particular sweetness that meant the opposite. "And nobody else is going to go out there. You know how he is." Clara was quiet for a moment. The brush moved in slow circles across the iron surface of the pot. "We already told him you'd be there by noon," Bess said. She'd been quiet until now, and when she spoke there was something slightly uncomfortable in her voice, like she'd agreed to this whole thing and was only now having second thoughts. "We sent word with the feed delivery this morning." Clara stopped scrubbing. She turned and looked at them fully. "You did what?" "Well, someone has to do it," Louisa said. "And you need the money, don't you? It's a good wage. He pays well enough, apparently. Better than Hattie." There was a beat of silence. The three women looked at her with varying degrees of expectation, and underneath the fake generosity of Louisa's tone, Clara could hear what this actually was. It was sport. She was being sent to Sawyer Kane's door the way you threw a stick into a dogfight, just to see what happened. The thing was, and this was the part Clara had to sit with for a long moment, right there in the mud with her hands red and the wind cutting through her coat. The thing was that she needed the money. She actually needed it. Hattie had cut her hours 2 weeks ago when business dropped off after the spring drive. Clara was behind on what she owed for her room, and she'd been eating less than she should because she was running the numbers in her head every time she sat down to a meal. Louisa knew this because Louisa's mother had mentioned it to someone who mentioned it to someone else, and news in Red Hollow moved like water through sand. Clara stood up. She dried her hands on her work apron. "What time did you say I should be there?" Something flickered across Louisa's face, brief and complicated, like she hadn't expected this answer. "Noon. He's expecting someone named Clara Whitmore." "Then I'll be there." She turned and went back inside without giving them anything else to look at. She borrowed a horse from the livery. Old Pete, the gray gelding that moved like he'd rather be asleep but was too professional to actually stop, and rode out to the broke spur with her coat buttoned against the wind and her good bag packed with 2 changes of work clothes and her mending kit. She told herself on the way out that she wasn't afraid. That was not quite true, but it was close enough to true that she could ride on it. The broke spur was, well, it was something. She came up the long approach road and saw the main house sitting low against the hillside, solid construction in its bones but neglected in every visible detail. The porch railing on the left side had pulled away from the post and was hanging at an angle. The front steps had a board missing, second from the top, she noted, making a mental note to step around it. Several of the window shutters had lost their hooks and were banging loosely against the siding. The yard between the house and the barn was not exactly filthy, but it had the specific disorder of a place where one person has been doing the work of 3 and has had to make decisions about what gets attended to and what gets left. There were chickens. They appeared to be in charge of the yard. The barn at least looked solid. The fencing on the near pasture was in good repair. This was a man who kept his animals better than his house, which told Clara something useful right away. She tied old Pete at the post and climbed the steps, avoiding the second from the top, and knocked. Nothing for a long moment. She knocked again. The door opened and Sawyer Kane looked at her. He was taller than she remembered from town. He had to duck slightly to stand in his own doorway, which had clearly been built by someone with more modest dimensions. His hair was dark and needed cutting, his jaw was unshaved going on 4 or 5 days, and his eyes were the gray of creek water in autumn. Not cold exactly, but not warm either. More like watchful. More like a man who decided a long time ago that waiting to see what something was before committing to a reaction was safer than the alternative. He looked at her for a moment that went on longer than was comfortable. "You're Clara Whitmore," he said. It wasn't a question, but it wasn't quite a statement either. "Yes." "You're from the boarding house." "Yes." He looked past her briefly at the road she'd come up, like he was checking whether there was someone else, someone more expected coming along behind her. Then he looked back at her. "They send you as a joke," he said flatly. Clara met his eyes without looking away. "Probably." Something shifted in his expression. It wasn't amusement, not quite, but it was adjacent to it. "And you came anyway." "I need the work." Another long moment. One of the loose shutters banged against the siding, and somewhere in the yard a chicken made an expression of general protest. "Come in," he said, and stepped back from the doorway. Bob. The inside of the house was better than the outside in some ways, and worse in others. The main room was large. The bones of it were good. High ceiling, stone fireplace along the south wall, solid pine floor that someone had built to last. But it had the look of a space that had been lived in hard and maintained minimally. The table was clear but scarred. The shelving along the far wall held supplies in no particular order. There was a coat rack that had too many coats on it, which was how the whole room felt, like things had been added and never sorted through. There was no softness to the place, no curtains, no rug. The fireplace had a good iron grate, but the mantel above it was bare and dusty. A kitchen at the back, through a narrow doorway. She could see from where she stood that the stove needed blacking and the work table needed a hard scrubbing. Sawyer stood in the middle of the main room with his arms crossed, watching her take it in. "There's a room off the kitchen," he said. "Smaller than it should be, but it has a window. The last woman who came said it wasn't fit. I cleaned it out after she left. You can judge for yourself." He paused. "The wage is $7 a week. Day off Sunday. You cook, clean, manage the house supplies. I have 2 ranch hands, but they bunk in the quarters by the barn and manage their own. You don't answer to them." Another pause. "I'm not easy to work for." "I heard," Clara said. "Then why are you here?" "I told you I need the work." She looked at him directly. "And I'm not easy to drive off." He studied her for a long moment with those watchful gray eyes, and she held her ground and let him look, because she had nothing to hide and nowhere else she particularly needed to be. 7:30, he said finally. "That's when breakfast should be on. I'll need to see the kitchen stores first, tonight before I start tomorrow." "Fine. And the second step on the front porch needs a new board." He blinked. "I know that. Just saying it'll be done by the end of the week if you have lumber." There was a beat. "There's lumber in the barn." "Then it'll get done." She picked up her bag. "Which direction is the kitchen?" He said. The room off the kitchen was small. Sawyer had not oversold that. But it had a window that faced east, and the morning light, when she checked it, came through clean and clear. There was a cot with a proper mattress, thin but functional, and a peg rail along one wall and a washstand in the corner. Someone had put up a small mirror above the washstand, crooked and slightly dusty, but there. Clara unpacked her 2 changes of clothes. She hung her extra coat on the peg rail. She set her mending kit on the washstand and squared it up with the edge. Then she went back to the kitchen and took stock. The pantry shelves were reasonably stocked: flour, cornmeal, salt pork, dried beans, a good supply of dried apple. Someone had bought in bulk and without much thought for variety, but there was enough to work with. The coffee tin was nearly full. She found eggs in a crock near the back door. Collected that morning, she thought, which meant he was at least keeping up with the chickens even if he'd let the house go. The stove was cold, but the firebox looked serviceable. She checked the flue. It drew fine. She could do something with this. She heard him come in from outside around the time she was inventorying the dry goods, his boots heavy on the back steps. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her, then at the array of items she'd pulled to the work table for assessment. "What are you doing?" he said. "Making a list of what you have and what you need." She didn't look up. "You're out of baking powder and nearly out of dried onion. I'll need to go into town by the end of the week if you want biscuits." "I don't go into town more than I have to." "You don't have to go. I can." She found a stub of pencil in her apron pocket and started writing on the back of an old supply receipt she'd found on the shelf. "I'll make a proper list." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him watching her, that particular quality of attention he had. Not hostile, but assessing, the way you watched a horse you weren't sure about yet. "The hands eat dinner with me," he said. 2 men, Doss and Charlie. They're fine. Just don't ask them to make conversation." "I don't need conversation." She paused. "How do you want your eggs in the morning?" However's fastest. Scrambled then. Fine. He left. She went back to her list. The first week was hard. She wouldn't pretend otherwise. Sawyer was not a man who gave instructions clearly. He would say something once, briefly, with the assumption that it had been understood, and then be visibly, not angry exactly, but tightly wound, when it turned out that one sentence had not conveyed the full picture. Clara spent the first 3 days figuring out how he organized his thinking, which was not the way most people organize their thinking. He was particular about certain things in ways that had nothing to do with cleanliness or order, and everything to do with systems. His systems. The ones he'd built in the absence of anyone else. The woodpile by the back door had to be stacked a specific way. The bridles in the tack room had a specific arrangement that was not immediately logical, but turned out to be organized by which horse they fit. The ledger on his desk was not to be moved or touched. She learned these things by paying attention, not by asking. Asking him questions seemed to make him uncomfortable in a way that made her feel like she was pressing on a bruise, so she watched instead and figured it out. In return, she was beginning to understand that he noticed more than he let on. On the 4th morning, she came out to the kitchen at 6 to start the stove and found that someone had already brought in firewood and stacked it in the box. On the 5th day, she noticed the broken shutter latch on the second window had been fixed sometime in the night. He didn't say anything about either of these things. Neither did she. The 2 ranch hands, Doss, who was somewhere north of 50 and had the hands of a man who'd done hard work his whole life, and Charlie, who was young and quiet and had a habit of eating with his eyes on his plate, treated her with a careful neutrality. Not unfriendly, not warm. Like men who'd seen people come and go from this place and had learned not to invest until they knew whether a person was staying. She could work with neutral. What she could not quite work with was the exhaustion. The work at the ranch was harder than the boarding house work, not because any single task was more difficult, but because the scope of it was larger and more varied. The house had years of deferred maintenance layered into it, and Clara had apparently decided, sometime in that first week without quite deciding it consciously, that she was going to address that deferred maintenance systematically. She started with the kitchen, because that was where she spent the most time and where cleanliness had the most direct effect on the food, which was the thing she was most immediately responsible for. She scrubbed the stove, blacked it properly, scoured the work table and the shelves, reorganized the pantry so that things were findable. She fixed the latch on the kitchen window herself with a piece of hardware she found in the barn workshop. She mended the curtain. There was a curtain. It had just been down and stuffed in the corner, and rehung it. On Saturday evening, coming in from hanging the washing, she found Sawyer standing in the kitchen doorway, looking at the curtain. He looked at it for a moment without saying anything. Then he looked at her. "That's been down for 2 years," he said. "I know. The rod bracket was bent. I straightened it." He looked at the curtain again. Just a plain cotton curtain, faded blue, nothing worth remarking on. But something in the way he looked at it made Clara feel like she was seeing something she maybe hadn't meant to see. "My wife made that," he said, before she left. Clara was quiet. She didn't know he'd had a wife. The town hadn't mentioned a wife, or if it had been in the category of things people said once and then didn't elaborate on. "I'm sorry," she said. She meant it simply, without elaboration, because elaboration usually made things worse. He looked away from the curtain. "Supper ready?" 20 minutes. "Fine." He went back through the main room. Clara stood in the kitchen for a moment and breathed. Then she went back to the stove. By the end of the second week, she had fixed the porch step, rehung 2 shutters, scrubbed the main room floor properly for the first time in what looked like years, and produced by accident more than design a standing menu of meals that managed to be filling and not tedious despite the limited stores. She had also begun to understand something about Sawyer Kane that the town of Red Hollow had not understood, or had not bothered to. He was not cruel. He was careful. There was a difference, and it mattered. A cruel man enjoyed causing pain. What Sawyer did, the flatness, the distance, the way he occupied a room like a man who was always calculating the fastest route to the door, was not cruelty. It was protection. He had built walls, and he maintained them, and the anger that sometimes leaked through the walls when he was pushed or frustrated was not the anger of a man who wanted to harm anything. It was the anger of a man who was overwhelmed and didn't have a better way to say so. This was not a comfortable thing to know about a person. It made him harder to stay angry at and harder to keep a certain professional distance from. Because a cruel man you could simply manage around, like a bad fence line, you mapped the danger and avoided it. A man who was just scared and armored was a different problem entirely. She didn't think about this too carefully. There was too much work to do. But she noticed it. On a Thursday evening toward the end of her second week, she was at the kitchen table after supper with her mending, a shirt of her own with a torn sleeve seam, when Sawyer came through from the main room and stopped. "You sew," he said, with the faint tone of someone stating an obvious thing and knowing it. "Yes." "Charlie's got a split in his saddle leather. He's been ignoring it. It's going to be a problem if it goes longer." He paused. "Do you do leather?" "I can. I'll need an awl and waxed thread. Is there any in the workshop?" "I'll look tomorrow." "All right." He stood there a moment longer than seemed necessary for the conversation they'd just had. Clara kept her eyes on her mending. "The biscuits this morning," he said. "They were good." She looked up. He was already half turned away. "Thank you," she said. He walked out to the main room without responding, but the back of his neck, she thought, had gone slightly darker than usual. Clara looked back at her mending and did not smile. She almost did, though. It was on a Friday afternoon at the end of her third week that the first visitors from Red Hollow arrived. She heard the horses before she saw them, coming up the approach road in the early afternoon, two riders moving fast enough that the sound carried ahead of them. She was in the yard at the time, feeding the chickens, and she straightened and watched them come. Nora Hale and Bess Calder, without Louisa. They pulled up at the yard gate and looked at Clara with the particular expression of people who have ridden 8 miles to find out something and are not pleased with what they've found. "You're still here," Nora said. Clara scattered the last of the feed across the yard. "I am." "Hattie wants to know when you're coming back." "I'm not coming back. I have work here." Bess shifted in her saddle. "Clara, this is—" She stopped, glanced toward the house. "Is he decent to you? Kane?" Clara looked at her. There was something in Bess's voice that was actually asking, actually wanting to know, not as sport. "He's fair," Clara said. "He's not easy, but he's fair." "People are talking," Nora said, "about you being out here alone with him. It doesn't look right." "People in Red Hollow talk about everything. They always have." "Clara, tell Hattie I said thank you for the work she gave me. I hope she finds someone for the pots who does as good a job." Clara picked up her empty feed bucket. "You should head back before it gets late. That road isn't good after dark." She went inside. Behind her, she heard Nora say something, sharp, under her breath, and then the sound of the horses turning and heading back down the road. She set the feed bucket by the barn door and stood for a moment with her hand on the rough wood of the wall. She was not going back. That was a thing she knew with a certainty she hadn't expected. Whatever came next, she was not going back. She went inside and started on supper. The supper she made that Friday evening was nothing remarkable. Salt pork and dried bean stew, biscuits from the second batch she'd made that week, coffee that had been sitting since mid-afternoon and was strong enough to strip paint. Sawyer ate it without comment, which she had come to understand was his version of approval. Doss asked for a second biscuit, which meant the same thing from him. Charlie ate with his eyes on his plate, as always, though she'd noticed he'd started sitting slightly less hunched over his food than he had in the first week, which she took as a good sign in the way you take small things as good signs when they're all you have. She didn't say anything about Nora and Bess's visit at supper. It wasn't Sawyer's business, and she wasn't certain yet how he'd react to the news that the town was already constructing a narrative about his household. She filed it away for later. Later came sooner than she expected. She was washing the supper dishes, the kitchen window dark now, the yard outside gone to shadow and cricket sound, when Sawyer came in from the main room and set his coffee cup on the work table. He didn't leave right away. She could hear him behind her, not moving, that particular stillness he had when something was sitting on him. She waited. "2 women came by this afternoon," he said. She kept washing. "I know, I was the one they came to see." "What did they want?" "To see if I was still here, mostly." She set a plate on the drying rack. "Hattie wants me back." "Are you going?" She turned around and looked at him. He was leaning against the work table with his arms crossed, watching her with that careful watchfulness, and she understood the question was not as casual as the way he'd asked it. "No," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he uncrossed his arms and picked up his coffee cup. "Good," he said, and went back through to the main room. Clara turned back to the dishes. She scrubbed the bottom of the bean pot and did not let herself read too much into a single word from a man she'd known 3 weeks. That was the kind of mistake that made women foolish, and whatever else she had never been foolish. But she noticed it, the way she noticed everything. April moved into the broke spur in a way that was almost imperceptible, and then suddenly all at once, the cold still coming off the ridge in the mornings, but the afternoons loosening up, the grass on the near pasture going from the pale, exhausted color of winter to something approaching green. The cattle in the far field looked less hunched. The chickens, who had been conducting their territorial disputes in a muted, cold-weather way all through March, escalated their drama considerably as the temperature rose, which Clara found inexplicably cheering. She had found her rhythm. She was up by 5:30, had the stove lit and coffee on before 6, breakfast ready by 7:30 as Sawyer required. She had learned his preferences without asking for them. Eggs scrambled, not wet, not dry, somewhere in the middle with a little salt, biscuits over cornbread when she had the ingredients for both, coffee black, no ceremony about it. He ate fast and without particular enjoyment, the way a man eats when eating is logistics rather than pleasure. And she had started, quietly, adding things that might make it less purely logistical. A small crock of preserved apples she'd found at the back of the pantry and warmed up. A little bacon fat rendered into the biscuits to make them richer. Things that didn't announce themselves, just appeared. He didn't comment on any of this directly, but he stopped leaving food on his plate, which he'd done every morning for the first week. The house was changing too, in the slow and incremental way that houses change when someone actually pays attention to them. She'd gotten all the shutters hung and latched properly. She'd scrubbed the main room floor twice, and the third time had worked Neat's foot oil into the pine boards, which had drunk it up like they were thirsty. The porch step was solid now, good lumber, properly set. She'd found a cracked window pane in the small room off the main hall, a room that appeared to be used for storage and had forgotten it was a room, and had asked Sawyer whether he wanted it repaired. He'd looked at it like he hadn't looked at it in years, which was probably true, and said he'd get glass next time he was in town. She'd gone to town instead, on old Pete, with the supply list and the window measurement written on a folded piece of paper in her coat pocket. Red Hollow had opinions about this, as Red Hollow had opinions about everything. She felt them when she went into Gruber's general store, the slight shift in the room, the way conversations tightened and then resumed at a different register. Mabel Gruber, who ran the store counter while her husband managed the back, gave Clara a long look that traveled from her face to the satchel over her arm to her face again. "You're still out at Kane's place," Mabel said, not making it a question. "I am." Clara set her list on the counter. "I'll need all of this if you have it in stock." "We have most of it." Mabel started reading down the list. "The window glass will need to be cut. Cost you extra." "That's fine." Put it on the ranch account. There was a small beat. Tiny, but Clara caught it. Ranch account meant she had Sawyer's authorization, which meant she was not simply a temporary arrangement. Mabel wrote it down without further comment, but the look she exchanged with the woman at the fabric table, a look Clara caught in her peripheral vision, said plenty. She got her supplies, and she got the window glass wrapped in burlap, and she went back to the ranch. She replaced the pane herself, caulked it against drafts with materials she found in the workshop, and moved on to the next thing. This was how April went. The thing Clara had not anticipated, not planned for, not steeled herself against in the way she'd steeled herself against everything else, was the evenings. Not every evening. Sawyer was often out late, checking the cattle, writing the fence lines, doing the accounting that kept a ranch solvent, all the invisible labor that kept the place functional. On those evenings, she had the house to herself, and she read or sewed or sat by the kitchen stove with a cup of tea and listened to the quiet, which was a different quality of quiet from anything she'd known in Red Hollow, where even the nighttime sounds carried the texture of other people's proximity. But some evenings Sawyer came in at a reasonable hour, and the house was too small to make pretending the other person wasn't there a workable strategy. It started small. Question about the fence repair on the east pasture. She'd noticed a section that looked questionable and mentioned it to him. He asked what she'd noticed, specifically, and she described it. And he asked how she knew what to look for, and she said her father had run a small farm when she was a child, and she'd grown up paying attention to things that cost money to fix if you ignored them. He was quiet for a moment. Where was this? East of here, smaller country. He died when I was 15. What happened after that? Mother remarried. I didn't get along with the man she married. She said this flatly, without elaboration, because the elaboration was not something she handed to people on first asking. I left when I was 18 and came to Red Hollow. Eventually. She paused. I wasn't there first. I worked a couple of other places. Red Hollow was just where I ended up. He turned his coffee cup slowly on the table. He had a habit of doing this when he was thinking. Just a quarter turn, back and forth, like a small physical anchor. I grew up here, he said. Not in Red Hollow exactly. On this land. My father's land. And now yours. And now mine. The cup turned. He was harder to work for than I am. She almost said something to that. Decided against it. Let it sit. The fence, he said, redirecting, and they went back to the practical, which was where both of them were most comfortable, and that was fine, but the conversation had happened. And the next evening, when she was at the kitchen table with the account ledger she'd asked his permission to look over, the household supplies ledger, not the ranch accounts, he came in and sat down across from her without quite being invited to do so, and they talked about the cost of baking powder versus making do without it, which was not an interesting conversation on its surface, but which lasted 40 minutes and somehow covered a surprising amount of other territory along the way. She was not falling for him. She was careful about this, the way you're careful handling something that could burn you. But she was finding that she was not, in his company, performing a version of herself that was smaller than the actual version. She was not editing herself down to the size that made other people comfortable. He didn't seem to need her to be smaller. He didn't seem to need her to be anything in particular, which was, in its own odd way, one of the most restful things she'd encountered in years. It was in early May that Doss said his first real thing to her. He came into the kitchen one afternoon when she was at the stove and stood in the doorway, in the way people stood in that doorway when they wanted something but weren't sure how to ask for it. Clara had learned to let people do this at their own pace. She stirred what was in the pot and waited. My daughter's birthday next week, Doss said, in the voice of a man reporting a geological fact. How old will she be? 7. Clara turned to look at him. He was a big man, worn down the way hard country wears people down, but his face when he said his daughter's age did something it didn't usually do. Went softer. She lives in town, he said, with my sister, since her mother passed. He cleared his throat. I was thinking, if you had any of that preserved apple left, she likes sweet things. I thought maybe, I'll make her something, Claire said. Apple cake, if I can manage it. I'll have it ready for you to take in on Saturday. He blinked. I don't want to put you to, Doss. She turned back to the stove. It's a 7-year-old's birthday. I'll make the cake. He stood there another moment. Thank you, Miss Clara. She hadn't been called Miss Anything in Red Hollow in 3 years. The boarding house women called her just Clara when they called her anything at all. Thank you, Doss. He left. She did make the cake, a real one, proper layers, with the last of the preserved apple and a little brown sugar cooked down into something that approximated icing, and she wrapped it carefully in cloth and sent it with him on Saturday morning. She learned later from Charlie, who had thawed considerably and now occasionally offered information voluntarily, that Doss had cried a little when he gave it to his daughter. Charlie reported this in the tone of a man who found other people's emotions puzzling but not unwelcome, and Clara absorbed it without comment. She had not expected to matter to anyone at this ranch. She had come out here for the wage and the distance from Red Hollow's social architecture. She had not expected to find that there were people here who could be mattered to, and who might, in their own ways, matter back. The town of Red Hollow, meanwhile, had not finished with its opinions. She heard things on her supply runs. Not directly. People in small towns were rarely direct, which was ironic given how little privacy any of them actually had, but in the particular way of communities where information was currency. She heard that Louisa Fitch had told her mother that the whole business with sending Clara to Kane's ranch had been a mistake, and she wanted no more part of it, which Clara filed away as more interesting than she let on. She heard that two of the more established ranchers in the valley, men named Pruitt and Holcomb, had been making remarks at the saloon about Sawyer Kane, about the broke spur, about whether a man who couldn't manage his own household was really in a position to hold the land he held. She did not know exactly what lay beneath these remarks. She suspected it was money, because it was usually money. Land, which was the same thing at a different stage of becoming. But she didn't have enough information to be certain, so she stored what she heard and kept her head down and kept working. She mentioned none of this to Sawyer. What she did do, without quite deciding to do it, was start paying closer attention to the ranch's operations. Not in an intrusive way. She stayed in her lane, managed her domain, didn't push into the livestock or land business that was his territory. But she listened when he talked through problems at the supper table, which he'd begun doing more frequently as May went on, in the absent-minded way of a man who'd been thinking alone for too long and had finally found a room that would hold conversation without bouncing it back at him strangely. She was a good listener. She had always been a good listener, partly because listening was what you did when people didn't invite you to speak, and partly because information was the one resource she'd always been able to accumulate without anyone else's permission. So she listened when he said the south pasture fence needed to be moved 40 yards north to get more use of the water access. She listened when he said the feed costs were running higher than they should for the return he was getting on the cattle. She listened when he said, in a tone that was careful and uninflected, that Pruitt's man had come by the east gate last week and offered to buy the water rights to the creek that ran through the Broke Spur's northern corner. That one she didn't let pass. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "Told him no." "Was he expecting you to?" Sawyer looked at her across the supper table. Doss and Charlie had already gone back to the bunkhouse. The lamp between them was burning low. "Probably not," Sawyer said. "What does Pruitt want with that water?" "He wants what everyone with more money than sense wants out here. More." He pushed his plate back. "He's been buying up land and rights on the east side of the valley for 3 years, piecemeal. None of the individual pieces look like much. Put them together, and he controls the water access for half the grazing land between here and Carver's Ridge." Clara was quiet for a moment. "And if he gets the creek rights from you, then I'm dependent on his goodwill for water on my north quarter, and goodwill is not something Pruitt trades in for free." "You need to document everything," she said. "Every time his man comes to the gate, every offer they make, in writing, dated." He looked at her with something she couldn't quite read. "I know that," he said, but not unkindly. "I know you know it. I'm saying you need to start doing it if you haven't been." He turned his coffee cup. 1/4 turn, back. "You think about these things. I grew up watching a farm get picked apart by the people who were supposed to be the neighbors." She folded her napkin, an old napkin, darned twice, but folded. "My father shook hands on things, trusted the men in his community, lost the Northfield and the well rights in 2 years. She looked at Sawyer steadily. "Write it down." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I'll pull out the deed records tomorrow. There are some easement questions I've been putting off. I can help you read through them, if you want." She paused. "I'm not a lawyer, but I can follow a document." He looked at her again with that look she couldn't read. It wasn't quite the look he'd given the curtain, that private, pressed-down look, but it was in that neighborhood. "All right," he said. "Try." They spent 3 evenings on the deed records and the property documents. Spread across the kitchen table after supper, the lamp turned up as high as it would go. Sawyer was not a patient man by nature. His mind moved fast and didn't like circling back. But with the documents, he was thorough in a way that surprised her, or maybe she had already stopped being surprised by the distance between who Sawyer Kane was and who Red Hollow said he was. She was good at this. She had a head for language, for the way a sentence meant one thing in its plain reading and another thing in the small qualifying clauses buried in the middle. Her mother had called it her contrary streak, the habit of reading what was actually written instead of what everyone assumed was written. It had not made her popular. It turned out to be useful. She found 2 easement clauses in the northeast boundary description that were ambiguous in ways that could matter. She flagged them. Sawyer looked at them, read them twice, and said a word under his breath that she pretended not to hear. Can you write out what the ambiguity is? He said. Plain language. So I can take it to the lawyer in Millhaven if it comes to that? Yes. When? I'll have it by Thursday. He looked at her across the documents. The lamp was throwing long shadows across the table, across his face, and he looked tired, she thought. Not physically tired, though that too, but tired in the particular way of a man who had been carrying weight alone for a long time. You didn't have to do this, he said. I know. Why did you? She thought about it honestly because he'd asked it honestly and he deserved something better than a polite deflection. Because it matters, she said. This land matters. And because someone offered me a problem that needed actual thinking, and it's been a while since that happened. He looked at her for a moment in that particular watchful way, and something in the watchfulness was different than it had been in the beginning, less wary, more... She didn't let herself name it too precisely, more present. Thursday, then, he said. Thursday. She had the document summary written by Wednesday. Actually, 2 pages, clear language, the ambiguities laid out with the relevant clause numbers beside them. And on Wednesday evening, she was in her room finishing the last page when she heard a horse come up the road fast. Not a working horse, not a casual rider. Fast and purposeful, the way riders came when they were bringing news. She heard Sawyer go out to the porch. She heard a voice she recognized, though it took her a moment to place it. Young, male, one of the stable boys from Gruber's livery in town. Mr. Kane, Miss Clara Whitmore, her room at the boarding house. Mrs. Drummond says if she doesn't come collect her things by end of the week, she'll sell them. There was a pause. She's not coming back, Sawyer said. His voice was flat and completely certain. Miss Whitmore works here now. Tell Drummond I'll send someone in for her things. Another pause. The boy, uncertain, clearly not having expected this answer. She also... Mrs. Drummond said to tell Miss Whitmore that the ladies are saying... He stopped, started again. That it isn't proper, her being out here. Is that what they're saying? Yes, sir. Tell them, Sawyer said in a voice that was calm the way a low sky before a storm is calm, to find something better to do with their time. The sound of the horse leaving, then the porch boards creaking under his weight as he came back inside. Clara had not moved from her chair. She sat with the pen still in her hand and the page half done. She heard him cross the main room, stop outside her door. You heard that, he said through the door. Yes. You have a problem with what I told him. She thought about it. No, she said. Good. A pause. You need anything? No. Then good night, Clara. Good night, Sawyer. She listened to him walk back across the main room and up the stairs. Then she turned back to the page and finished the document, in her clean and careful hand, in the light of the lamp. While outside the wind came down from the ridge, and the night settled over the Broke Spur the same as it always did, indifferent to what anyone in Red Hollow thought about any of it. She blotted the last sentence and set the pen down and looked at what she'd written. She was not going back. She knew this the way you know the things that have already been decided in the part of you that decides things before your thinking mind catches up. She was here. This was the place she was. What that meant exactly, she didn't know yet. But it was the first time in as long as she could remember that not knowing didn't feel like a threat. The document summary she'd written sat on Sawyer's desk for 2 days before he read it. Not because he was avoiding it, but because the end of May brought a run of fence problems along the south pasture that had him and Doss out from first light until past dark. Clara kept the house, kept the meals, kept the rhythm of the place running without being asked to. And when he finally came in on a Thursday evening, too tired to do much more than sit at the kitchen table with his boots still on, she set a plate in front of him and a cup of coffee and didn't say anything about the document or anything else. He ate. Then he said, without looking up from his plate, I read what you wrote. All right. The northeast easement. You're right that it's ambiguous. He turned his coffee cup. I've been ignoring it because dealing with it meant going to Millhaven, and I've been putting off Millhaven. Why? A pause. The lawyer there is a man named Aldous Crane. He handled my divorce. He said it without inflection, the way you say a thing when you've decided to say it and are not going to ornament it. I don't particularly want to sit across a desk from him again. Clara said nothing for a moment. She was at the stove, moving things that didn't strictly need moving, giving him space in the way she'd learned he needed. Is there another lawyer? There's one in Carver's Ridge, younger man. I don't know him. That might be better anyway. Fresh eyes on the documents. No history. He looked up at her then. She was turned halfway toward him, and in the lamplight his face had that particular quality it sometimes had in the evenings. Less guarded, the edges softer, not because anything had changed, but because a full day of hard work burned through the top layer of armor and left the man underneath more visible. "You think like a practical person," he said. "Is that a compliment?" It was meant as one. She turned back to the stove. "Then thank you." He finished his supper and took the document to his desk, and she heard him in there for another hour, the slow sound of pages turning, before the lamp went out and the house went quiet. She lay in her narrow room and listened to the night sounds of the broke spur, the cattle settling, the wind off the ridge, the occasional protest from the chickens about something that offended them in the dark, and thought about Millhaven and lawyers and a word he'd said without emphasis, divorce, dropped into the conversation like a stone into still water. And she thought about what it meant to be a man who'd lost a wife and a marriage, and whatever story he'd told himself about his life, and then come back to this land and pulled it around himself like the only shelter left. She thought about these things until she was too tired to think anymore, and then she slept. But June came in dry and hot, the way the high country sometimes went, the grass on the ridge burning off to yellow gold by the second week, the creek running lower than Sawyer liked. He rode the water sources twice a week now, checking levels, and his expression on returning to the house had a particular tightness that Clara had learned to read as worry he wasn't going to name out loud. She named it for him one morning over breakfast, because she was tired of watching him carry it alone. "The creek's lower than last year," she said. "Yes." "Is that normal for a dry June?" "Sometimes." He poured his second cup of coffee. "Sometimes it means the summer's going to be hard." He set the pot down. Pruitt dammed a tributary 2 years ago on his land, upstream of here. His right to do it legally, technically, but it changed the flow. Clara looked at him steadily. "Did you know about that when it happened?" "I found out after." His jaw had that set it got. "I wasn't paying attention to the right things at the right time." This was, she understood, not simply a statement about water rights. She let it sit. "The ambiguity in the easement," she said carefully. "If it goes against you, what does that mean for the creek access?" "It means Pruitt can make a legal argument for restricting the flow further." He looked at his coffee cup, which is probably why his man keeps coming to the gate offering to buy the water rights outright. He's trying to get it cheap before he forces the issue in court. And if you go to the lawyer in Carver's Ridge now, before he files anything, then I'm ahead of it instead of behind it. He looked up. "I know. I'm going next week." "Good." He almost smiled. It was the almost smile she'd been cataloging since March, the one that didn't quite reach the full commitment of an actual smile, but got close enough that you could see the shape of what it would look like. "You're going to tell me I should have gone 2 months ago," he said. "You should have gone 2 months ago." "There it is. You asked." "I didn't actually ask. You implied." He did smile then, briefly, a real one, and it changed his whole face in the way smiles do on people who don't use them often, like a window opening in a wall you'd started to think was solid. It was gone in a moment, but it had been there. And Clara filed it away with everything else she was filing away, carefully, in a part of herself that she hadn't quite named yet. She had been at the Broke Spur for just over 2 months when Hattie Drummond came in person. Clara was in the yard on a Wednesday morning, mending a piece of split harness leather while the morning was still cool enough to work comfortably outside, when she heard the buggy coming up the approach road. She recognized the vehicle before she recognized the driver, the particular square shape of Hattie's rented buggy, the gray mare that pulled it with an expression of permanent resignation. She set the harness down and stood up. Hattie Drummond was a woman who occupied space efficiently. She was not large, but she carried herself in a way that suggested she expected the world to rearrange itself slightly to accommodate her passage through it. She was 52 or 53, iron gray hair pulled back without ceremony, practical dark dress, no-nonsense boots. She climbed down from the buggy without assistance and looked at Clara with the expression of a woman who had driven 8 miles with a purpose and intended to accomplish it. "Clara," she said. "Mrs. Drummond, you look well." This was said with the slight flavor of surprise that Clara had grown used to from people who'd expected to find her diminished and hadn't. "I am well," Clara gestured toward the porch. "Would you like to come inside?" "I'd rather say what I came to say right here." Hattie looked around the yard, the repaired fencing, the tidy woodpile, the chickens going about their business with their usual drama, with an expression that took things in without commenting on them. "You've been gone long enough that the room's gone to someone else. I want you to know that's not—" She paused. "I'm not coming here to cause trouble. I want to know you're all right." Clara looked at her with something that was almost warm. Hattie had her faults. She was tight with money and looser with opinion than she should have been, and she had a way of managing people that stopped just short of outright manipulation. But she was not a dishonest woman, and this, Clara thought, was genuine. "I'm all right," Clara said. "Better than all right. The town is talking." The town was always talking. Hattie's mouth pressed into a line that might, on a different woman, have been a wry smile. "True enough." She looked at Clara directly. "He treats you decent?" "Yes." "People are saying it's not proper, you living out here." "People are going to say what they're going to say." "Clara," Hattie's voice shifted slightly. Not softer exactly, but more honest. "I'm not one of the ones saying it, but there are men in this town, Pruitt, Holcomb, some of the others, who are going to use it. Use you, specifically. Use the talk to make trouble for Kane." She paused. "There's something going on with the land out here that I don't fully understand, but I hear things in that boarding house, and what I hear is that Pruitt's been waiting for a reason to push at Kane, and he might have found one." Clara was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the yard, lifting the loose hair at the back of her neck. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I didn't come all the way out here to be thanked. I came because whatever else you are, you're not stupid, and somebody ought to tell you plain." Hattie picked up her reins. "I'm sorry I didn't pay you better. You were worth more than I paid you." This, more than anything else Hattie had said, was unexpected enough that Clara had no immediate answer for it. Hattie climbed back into the buggy. "You need anything? You can still come to me. That's all I wanted to say." She turned the buggy and drove back down the road, and Clara stood in the yard watching until the dust settled back into the ruts. And then she went inside and told Sawyer what Hattie had said. He listened without interrupting, which was one of his better qualities. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, then, "How much does she know about the water situation?" "Not much. What she hears through the boarding house." "Which is enough." He stood up from where he'd been sitting at the table and went to the window, hands in his pockets, looking out at the yard. "Pruitt's been talking to Holcomb. I know that. What I don't know is what they're building toward." "You need to go to Carver's Ridge before the end of the week," Clara said. "Not next week, this week." He turned from the window. "I was going Thursday." "Go tomorrow." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're not—" He stopped. "What?" "Nothing." He looked back out the window. "I'll go tomorrow." He went to Carver's Ridge the next morning and came back in the afternoon with a name. The lawyer was Harlan Briggs, 38 years old, 5 years at the territorial bar, and an appointment for the following Tuesday. He told Clara about it at supper, briefly, in the clipped way he delivered news he considered serious, and she nodded and passed the salt and did not make a performance of having been right about the timing. That Saturday was when Pruitt came. She heard the horses first, several of them, which was unusual for this road on a weekend. She was in the kitchen, and she went to the window and saw 4 riders coming up the approach in a loose group, not moving fast, moving with the particular deliberateness of men who want you to see them coming from a long way off. She went out to the porch. Sawyer was already there, on the steps, having come from the barn. He stood with his arms at his sides, not crossed, which she had learned meant he was more serious, not less. Pruitt was a large man, wide through the chest, red-faced in the way of men who ate and drank well, and spent enough time outdoors to bake the color in. He was perhaps 60, silver hair under his hat, dressed in the careful way of a man who wanted you to know he could afford to be. Beside him rode Holcomb, who was leaner and quieter and watched everything with small, pale eyes. The other 2 were ranch hands there for the size of the group. They stopped at the yard gate. Pruitt looked at the house, at Sawyer, and then, with the particular deliberateness of a man making a point, at Clara on the porch. "Kane," he said. Pruitt. Just riding by. Thought we'd stop in. He said this with the ease of a man who knew nobody would believe it and didn't care. See how things are out here. Things are fine, Sawyer said. You can keep riding. Pruitt smiled. It was a large smile, the kind that was mostly territory. No need to be unfriendly. He looked at Clara again. This the woman from the boarding house? The Whitmore woman? The way he said it, the Whitmore woman, compressed her into something smaller than a person. Clara looked at him and said nothing. She seems to be a permanent fixture, Pruitt said, still looking at her. Whole town's noticed. What the whole town notices is not my concern, Sawyer said. What is my concern is you being on my approach road without an invitation. So. Pruitt's smile didn't move, but something behind it did. Just friendly neighbors, Kane? We've never been friendly neighbors? No, I suppose we haven't. Pruitt pulled his horse slightly sideways, casual, the way a big man shifts his weight to remind you how big he is. I've got a standing offer on those creek rights. Good offer. You know the numbers. I know them. Dry summer like this one's shaping up to be, a man could use the cash against the feed costs. He paused. Especially a man running a household on his own. Another look at Clara. Or not quite on his own, depending on how you count it. The yard was very quiet except for the chickens and the wind. Clara came down off the porch steps. She did this without deciding to do it. Or if she decided, the decision happened somewhere below the level of thought. She walked to stand beside Sawyer. Not behind him, not back from him, but level. And she looked at Pruitt directly. Mr. Pruitt, she said, was there something specific you needed today? Or did you ride 8 miles in the heat to look at a woman and make suggestions about water rights you've already been told no about? Pruitt looked at her with the particular expression of a man who is not accustomed to being addressed by someone he's categorized as unaddressable. Something moved through his eyes. Irritation, reassessment, something. Ma'am, he said carefully, I don't think I was talking to you. No, she said. You were talking about me, which is different. If you have business with Mr. Kane regarding the property, you can arrange an appointment. Otherwise, she turned slightly and looked at the road behind them. You know the way back. Holcomb made a sound that might have been a cough or might have been something else. One of the ranch hands shifted in his saddle. Pruitt looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Sawyer. Sawyer said nothing. He simply stood there. And the thing about Sawyer Kane in that moment was that he let Clara's words stand without covering them over, without stepping in front of them, without doing the thing that men often did when a woman spoke plainly in front of other men, which was to smooth it away. He let it stand. Pruitt gathered his reins. Think carefully about the offer, Kane. I have thought carefully, Sawyer said. The answer's the same. Pruitt turned his horse, and the 4 riders went back down the road at a walk, and Clara watched them go with her heart beating faster than she was going to admit to anyone, and the yard was quiet. She became aware that Sawyer was looking at her. She looked back at him. Well, she said, which was all she had. Well, he agreed, which was all he said. They went inside. Mom. The week after Pruitt's visit, something changed in Red Hollow. She felt it on her supply run that Tuesday. A different quality to the look she received, no longer the low-level speculative curiosity of before, but something harder. When she stopped at Gruber's, Mabel behind the counter was polite in the specific way of people who have decided to be polite and are making sure you know it's a decision. The woman at the fabric table, Clara still didn't know her name, she'd become simply the woman at the fabric table, turned away entirely, finding something to examine on the wall shelf that had nothing on it. It was at the post office, where she stopped to collect Sawyer's correspondence, that she encountered Louisa Fitch. Louisa was coming out as Clara was going in. They stopped in the doorway, briefly, and it was the first time Clara had spoken to her directly since that morning in the mud behind the boarding house. Louisa had the look of a woman who was experiencing something she'd rather not. She held a package under one arm, and her eyes went to Clara and then away and then back. Clara, she said. Louisa. A pause that had too much in it for a doorway. I heard what happened, Louisa said, with Pruitt coming out to the ranch. She said it quietly, like something she didn't want overheard. I didn't have anything to do with that. I know, Clara said. And she did know. Pruitt was not a man who needed Louisa Fitch to direct him anywhere. "What I did before," Louisa said, meaning the morning with the mud and the laugh and we told him you'd be there by noon. "I wasn't thinking about what it meant for you." Clara looked at her. She could be angry. She had a perfect right to be angry, but the anger, she found, was not something she wanted to spend here. In a post office doorway, on a woman who was at least standing in front of her and saying the thing, instead of pretending none of it had happened. "I know that too," Clara said. Louisa looked at her with something complicated in her face. "You're not going to make this easy, are you?" "I'm not going to make it hard," Clara said. "I don't have the energy." She shifted Sawyer's correspondence under her arm. "Excuse me." She went inside and collected the rest of the mail and went back out to Old Pete and rode back to the ranch without letting herself think too much about that conversation, because thinking too much about it would lead to thinking too much about all of it, the years of it, the accumulated weight of being the woman that people didn't think about until they needed something done, and she was not going to do that in the middle of the road in full daylight. She saved it for later that night, lying in her small room, and allowed herself exactly as much of it as she needed to, and then she set it down and let herself sleep. The following Thursday, she was at the kitchen work table making bread when she heard Sawyer come in from Carver's Ridge earlier than she expected. She heard him stop in the main room, heard the particular sound of a man who has received information he is processing, and then he came to the kitchen doorway. "Sit down," he said. She looked at him. His expression was controlled in the way it got when he was keeping a lid on something. "Tell me standing up." He took his hat off and set it on the work table. Briggs looked at the documents. The easement clause, the ambiguous one. He says Pruitt's legal team has already filed a preliminary inquiry with the territorial office 2 weeks ago. Clara's hand stilled in the dough. "He filed before you got to Briggs," she said. "Yes." The word came out flat. "If I'd gone 2 weeks earlier..." "Don't." She said it clearly, not harshly. "What does Briggs say we can do?" He looked at the hat on the table. "File a counterclaim. Challenge the interpretation of the easement. It's not a losing case. Briggs thinks the language favors my reading, but it's going to take time and it's going to cost money. And while it's pending, Pruitt can make the argument that the water use is disputed and get a temporary restriction ordered. How long would a temporary restriction last? Months. Through the summer, maybe into fall?" He looked up at her. "If the summer's as dry as it's looking, losing water access on the North Quarter for 4 months?" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Clara pulled her hands out of the dough and wiped them on her apron. She stood with her back to the work table and thought through it with the part of her mind that was good at this, the part that had always been good at reading a problem clearly even when the problem was unpleasant. "The cattle on the North Quarter," she said. "How many head?" 63. "Could you move them to the south pasture? It's already running at capacity. What if you sold 30 head now, before the summer prices drop?" She was thinking as she spoke. "You take the cash, you cover Briggs's fees, you move the remaining North Quarter cattle to the south pasture at a reduced load. It's tight, but it might hold. And you fight the legal case from a position where Pruitt's restriction doesn't break you in the meantime." The kitchen was quiet. The bread dough sat on the work table between them, waiting. Sawyer was looking at her with the look she couldn't name. It had been getting harder to not name it. "That's..." He stopped. "Is the math wrong?" "The math isn't wrong." He seemed to be working out how to say something. "You've been thinking about this ranch like it's where I live," she said simply. "What happens to it matters to me." He looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in the room, or in him, or in the particular quality of the air between them, and she felt it the way you feel a change in weather before the sky actually changes. "I'll call Doss in tonight," he said finally. "We'll look at the numbers on the cattle." "All right. Clara," she met his eyes, "I'm going to need you to come to Carver's Ridge with me next week, when I meet with Briggs again. I need another set of eyes on these documents." He said it in the same tone he might use to say, "I need someone to check the fence line." Matter of fact, no ceremony. But the choice of her specifically, her eyes, her judgment, landed in her chest with a quiet weight. "If you're willing." "I'm willing," she said. He nodded, picked up his hat, and went back through to the main room, and Clara turned to her bread dough and pressed her hands into it, and thought that this was the thing about being useful, the real thing, Not the performing of usefulness, but the actual thing. It accumulated. It built up, quiet day after quiet day, into something that was no longer just a wage and a room and a roof. She didn't know what to call it yet. She was careful about naming things too early, but she knew what it felt like. It felt like ground that held. Inya. The storm that had been building in Red Hollow broke on a Saturday afternoon in the third week of June, and it broke at the Broke Spurs front gate. She was on the porch when they came, and this time it was not Pruitt with his careful large man deliberateness, but something worse in its way. Louisa Fitch's mother, a woman named Vera. Bess Calder's mother. Two women from the ladies' auxiliary whose names Clara knew but had never exchanged more than a few words with. And behind them, in Hattie Drummond's buggy, Hattie herself, who Clara understood immediately was not here by choice. 6 women, 3 buggies. And behind the last buggy, coming separately, riding alone, was Gerald Pruitt. He pulled up outside the fence line and stayed there, and Clara understood that he had not organized this, but these women were not his arrangement, but he had heard about it and followed it, because anything that pressured Sawyer Kane's household was information and leverage. Vera Fitch came through the gate first. She was a handsome woman past 60 who had the particular confidence of someone who had never significantly questioned their own judgment. "Clara Whitmore," she said, "I think we need to talk." Clara stayed on the porch steps. "Mrs. Fitch, you need to come back to town." Vera said it with the brisk finality of someone announcing a decision that has already been made. "What you're doing out here, it's not right, and the whole valley knows it, and it reflects badly on every decent woman in Red Hollow." "I'm working," Clara said. "I'm the housekeeper here." "It's not appropriate. You know it's not appropriate." Clara looked past Vera to the other women. Bess Calder's mother had the expression of someone who had come along because she'd been swept up in it and was not entirely sure she agreed with the mission. The 2 auxiliary women looked settled in their righteousness. Hattie stood slightly back, and her eyes, when they met Clara's, said plainly, "I was brought, not asked." "I have a job here," Clara said. "I have a wage and a room and work that I do well. I haven't done anything wrong. People are talking. People talk about everything. You talked about me when I was scrubbing pots behind the boarding house. You talked about me before that." She kept her voice level. It took effort. "You talked about me when I came to town at 18 with nowhere to go, and you talk about me now. I haven't been able to stop people talking in 8 years, and I've given up trying." Vera's face had reddened. "This is different. Being out here alone with a man—" "I'm not alone. There are 2 ranch hands who live and work on this property." "Clara, don't be naive. The appearance is that I keep this house and do my job and mind my business." She took one step down from the porch, and she was aware of how she looked, broad and plain, and wearing a work apron, and not a thing about her appearance that matched what these women considered the proper presentation of a respectable woman. And she held their eyes anyway, because she was done looking away from people who wanted her smaller. "I'm not going back to the boarding house. I am not leaving this job. I'm sorry if that embarrasses you, but I don't think it actually does. I think you came here because it's what you do when you decide something should be a certain way, and it isn't." A voice came from behind her. "The lady said she's not going." Sawyer was in the doorway. He'd come in from the barn without her hearing him, and he stood in the frame of the door with his arms at his sides and looked at the assembled women and then at Pruitt, still at the fence line, with an expression that made the yard feel very quiet. Vera looked at him. "Mr. Kane, this is—" "I heard what it is." He came down the steps and stood beside Clara. Beside her, not in front of her. "Miss Whitmore is a paid employee of this property, engaged under a clear working arrangement, and she's been nothing but a credit to this household since the day she came. Whatever you've decided to make of that is your business, but this visit is done." Vera opened her mouth. "I'll tell you plainly," Sawyer said, and his voice had the low quiet of a man who is not going to repeat himself. "I know Pruitt brought you here, or followed you. Same difference." He looked past them to the fence line. "I know what he's trying to do, and I know that you—" He looked back at Vera, at the auxiliary women, with a directness that was not unkind but was absolutely without softness. "You've been useful to him today without meaning to be. I don't hold that against you. But this conversation is finished." "Oh, Vera stared at him, stared at Clara. Her face moved through several things. Then, with the rigidity of a woman preserving her dignity under difficult conditions, she turned and walked back to her buggy. The others followed. The yard gate swung closed. Pruitt, at the fence line, looked at Sawyer for a long moment. Then he turned his horse and rode away without a word. The dust from the departing buggies settled slowly back onto the road. Clara and Sawyer stood on the front step and didn't say anything for a long time. The chickens, who had watched all of this with their heads tilted and their feet planted, resumed their usual business. "Thank you," she said finally. "I didn't do anything you weren't doing. You backed me up." He looked at her, and the look, the one she'd been refusing to name for weeks, was there, unguarded for once, not calculated, just there, like something that had been pressing against a wall for a long time and had finally gotten tired of pressing. "You don't need backing up," he said quietly, "but I'll give it anyway." She didn't answer that. She wasn't sure she had an answer that she was ready to say out loud. But she stood beside him on the step of his house. In the afternoon sun, with the valley spread out below them, and the ridge going gold at the top, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she didn't feel like she was standing somewhere she'd been put. She felt like she was standing somewhere she had chosen, and nobody, not the town, not Pruitt, not the ladies with their auxiliary certainty, could undo the choosing. It was hers. That ground was hers. The women's buggies had barely cleared the ridgeline when Sawyer went back inside without another word, which was how he handled things that had cost him more than he wanted to show. Clara heard him in the main room, the particular sound of a man moving without purpose, picking things up and setting them down. And she stayed on the porch a few minutes longer and let the afternoon settle around her before she went in to start supper. Neither of them talked about what had happened at the evening meal. Doss and Charlie ate with their usual efficiency and went back to the bunkhouse, and Sawyer pushed food around his plate more than he ate it, and Clara drank her coffee and watched the lamp flame and thought her own thoughts. It was only when she got up to clear the table that he said quietly, to the middle distance somewhere between his plate and the wall, "I should have handled Pruitt months ago." She stacked the plates and didn't turn around. "You couldn't have known what he was building toward." "I knew enough." He said it with the flat honesty of a man who'd been sitting with a piece of self-knowledge long enough that it had stopped being comfortable. "I knew the water situation. I knew the easement was soft. I let it sit because dealing with it meant dealing with Millhaven and Crane and all of it, and I didn't want to." A pause. "I let my problems become your problems." Clara turned around then. He was looking at the table, not at her, and his face had the particular quality it got when he was saying the true version of something rather than the managed version. "Sawyer." She used his name deliberately because she'd noticed he paid attention when she did. "Your problems were already going to be your problems whether I was here or not. I showed up because Louisa Fitch thought it was funny. Everything after that I chose." She set the plates back down and looked at him directly. "Stop carrying things that aren't yours to carry." He looked up at her, that look again, the one that had no name she was willing to assign yet. "You're going to tell me the same applies to me," she said, preempting it. "I wasn't going to say anything," he said. "Good." They looked at each other across the table for a beat too long to be purely practical, and then she picked up the plates again and took them to the kitchen, and she heard him exhale behind her, long and slow, like something that had been held too tight, finally releasing a fraction. She washed the dishes and went to her room and lay on her cot, and stared at the ceiling and told herself clearly and firmly that she was going to continue being sensible about this situation. She was not confident she believed herself. The meeting with Harlan Briggs in Carver's Ridge happened on a Monday, 5 days after the confrontation in the yard. Sawyer drove the wagon, and Clara sat beside him on the bench with the deed documents in a leather satchel on her lap, and they covered the 12 miles to Carver's Ridge mostly in silence, which was a comfortable silence by now, the kind that didn't need to be filled. Carver's Ridge was larger than Red Hollow, a proper town with a surveyor's office, a bank, 2 general stores, and a hotel with a dining room that served actual food rather than whatever the cook felt like making. Briggs had his office above the bank, a clean and crowded room that smelled of paper and lamp oil, with a desk buried under document stacks and a set of shelves that had given up any pretense of organization. Harlan Briggs was a lean, precise man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the kind of hands that moved quickly and with purpose when he was talking, which was most of the time. He looked at Clara when Sawyer introduced her, not with the sliding glance of someone cataloging her appearance, but with the direct assessment of someone measuring her usefulness to the conversation. "You're the one who found the easement language," he said. "I flagged it," she said. Sawyer made the determination that it mattered. Briggs looked between them and said nothing about this particular allocation of credit, but something in his expression registered it. "Well, let's look at what we have." They sat for 2 hours. Briggs laid the territorial filing from Pruitt's lawyers on one side and the Broke-Spur deed documents on the other, and they went through the Northeast easement clause with the kind of attention that made Clara's eyes ache by the end of it. She had brought her written summary, the 2-page document she'd given Sawyer 6 weeks ago, and Briggs read it and set it down and looked at her over his spectacles. "You've done this before," he said. "Document work." "No," she said. "I just read carefully." "Same thing, in practice." He tapped the relevant clause with one finger. "Your reading is right, and it's defensible. The clause says access rights, not exclusive access rights. Pruitt's people are arguing that the historical use establishes exclusivity by implication, which is a reach." He paused. "It's not a losing reach. It's the kind of thing that depends enormously on which judge handles the filing." "Who handles it?" Sawyer said. "Judge Karn in the territorial court. He's fair, but he's slow. We're talking a full hearing no earlier than September." Briggs folded his hands. "In the meantime, the temporary restriction request is the immediate problem. I can file a counter motion by end of week. I'd put our odds at 60-40 in your favor on the temporary question." 60-40 is not great," Sawyer said. "No, but it's better than not filing." Briggs looked between them again. "The cattle sale plan is smart. It reduces your exposure if the restriction goes through. I'd execute that before the hearing if I were you." Sawyer nodded. He was looking at the documents, not at Clara, but she saw his jaw work slightly. The particular movement that meant he was absorbing something he didn't like but was going to deal with. "There's one more thing," Briggs said. He paused, choosing his words with the care of a man who'd learned to do so. "The women's visit to your property. The public confrontation." He looked at Sawyer. "Pruitt is going to use the situation at your ranch as part of his character argument. It won't affect the legal merits of the easement case directly, but in a territorial court, reputation is not nothing. A judge is a person. People respond to the total picture." The room was quiet. "What are you saying?" Sawyer said. Briggs looked at him steadily. "I'm saying that how your household appears to the court's community matters to the outcome. Not dispositive, but it matters." Sawyer said nothing. Clara said nothing. Outside the window, Carver's Ridge went about its business without particular concern for anyone's legal troubles. "I understand," Sawyer said finally. They drove back to the Broke-Spur in the afternoon heat, 12 miles, and the silence on the return journey was a different quality from the silence going out. Clara watched the road and thought through what Briggs had said and what he hadn't said. And she thought about Pruitt and Holcomb and the women's auxiliary and the specific mechanism by which a man with money and patience built pressure until something gave. She thought about what was at stake, not her stake. She was clear-eyed about that. She was an employee. If the ranch went under, she would lose her job and her room and the life she'd built here in 4 months, and that would be a real loss, a significant one. But she would not lose her land or her cattle or the thing her father built and left to her. Sawyer would. She thought about that most of the way home. The cattle sale happened the following week. Sawyer and Doss culled 31 head from the North Quarter. Not the 30 Clara had suggested, but 31, because Sawyer found one more animal he'd been meaning to sell before winter anyway, and drove them to the livestock market in Mill Haven, which was a 2-day ride. He was gone for 3 days. He came back with the cash, a receipt from the market, and the particular tightness around his mouth of a man who has done a necessary thing that felt like retreat. Clara had supper ready. She'd made something better than usual, a proper roast, with the last of the root vegetables from the cellar, because she'd had 3 days to think and had decided that what was needed when he got back was something that felt like the opposite of defeat. He ate most of it. That was a good sign. Briggs filed the counter motion, he said, over the second cup of coffee. "I know." He sent a letter. "The hearing on the temporary restriction is August 3rd. 5 weeks?" "Yes." He turned the cup. The lamp was burning between them and the night outside the window was very dark and very quiet. Holcomb has been telling people at the saloon that I'm in financial trouble, that the cattle sale was distress selling. People who know cattle will know the difference between a distress sale and a strategic reduction. Not everyone knows cattle. Then they'll figure it out in time. She folded her hands on the table. Let them talk, Sawyer. It doesn't change the numbers. He looked at her. You're very steady, he said. You know that. She considered this. I've had practice at being steady when things were bad. It's not a talent. It's just what you develop when you don't have the option of falling apart. He was quiet for a moment. What did you fall apart about when you were allowed to? It was the most personal question he'd asked her. She looked at him and measured what to answer with, and she gave him a real piece of it because he'd asked a real question. When my father died, she said, I fell apart about that. I was 15 and I fell apart properly for about 3 weeks, and then my mother's grief took up all the available space, and I had to put mine somewhere else and get useful. She paused. I think I've been getting useful ever since. He held her gaze with an expression that was neither pity nor awkwardness, but something more direct. The look of a person actually seeing another person, not the version of them that's convenient. That's a long time to be useful, he said. It's not all bad, she said. You get good at things. He nodded slowly. Then, my father used to say the land doesn't care about your feelings. It only responds to what you do. He looked at the window. He was mostly right, but I think he used it as an excuse not to have any. Did it work? As an excuse? Yes. As a life? He looked back at her. No. She absorbed this. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked. The lamp burned. Sawyer, she said, whatever happens in August, with Briggs and the hearing and all of it, you built this ranch. The actual thing, the working of it. Pruitt didn't build anything. He acquired it. There's a difference, and the difference matters. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face that she didn't try to read too precisely. Why does it matter to you, he said. This ranch. Why does it actually matter to you? The question sat in the air between them. It was a fair question. It was, in fact, the question she'd been careful not to ask herself too directly because she suspected the answer had layers she wasn't ready to excavate in the light. Because I'm here, she said, and what's here matters to me. Both of those things are true, and I don't think I need to explain them further. He held her gaze and she held his, and neither of them said anything for a beat that lasted longer than was strictly comfortable, and then he looked down at his coffee cup and she stood up and cleared the plates. I'll have the bread started early tomorrow, she said. The flour supply's getting low. I'll add it to the list. Fine, he said. She went to the kitchen and she could feel, at the back of her neck, the specific warmth of a room that has said something it didn't say out loud. 3 days before the August 3rd hearing, Pruitt made his final move. It came in the form of a letter delivered to the Broke Spur by a man Clara didn't recognize. A legal runner from Millhaven, young and uncomfortable, who handed the envelope to her at the door and left quickly. She took it inside and set it on Sawyer's desk and went to find him. He was in the workshop, repairing a piece of harness equipment, and he read the letter standing up, still holding the leather strap in one hand. His face went very still. What is it? She said. He handed it to her without a word. It was from Pruitt's legal team, but the substance of it was Pruitt. It was an offer, a formal offer, dressed in legal language, for the purchase of the Broke Spur in its entirety. Buildings, land, water rights, cattle, everything. The number offered was fair by a cold calculation, which made it worse. It was not an insulting offer, not an obvious lowball. It was the offer of the man who had done his arithmetic correctly and knew precisely what your situation was worth. When you were about to go into a legal hearing, you might lose. There was a clause at the bottom. In the careful language of lawyers, the offer would remain open for 72 hours from the date of delivery. 3 days, until the morning of the hearing. Clara read it twice. She set it on the workbench. Sawyer had his back to her, standing at the workshop door, looking out at the yard. The afternoon light fell across his shoulders and the back of his neck, and he was very still in the specific way he got when he was holding something together through the pure mechanical effort of not moving. He's offering you a way to walk away clean, she said. I know what he's offering. And a way to walk away with enough money to start somewhere else. I know that too. His voice was flat and quiet. Are you going to tell me to take it? No, she said. He turned around. It would solve the problem. It would solve this problem by giving you a different one that you'd carry for the rest of your life. She looked at him steadily. This is your father's land. It's your land. Taking Pruitt's money because he pressured you into it, that's not walking away clean. That's losing. Clara, I know the hearing is a risk. I know 60-40 isn't a guarantee. I know the summer's been dry and the cattle are down 31 head and the legal fees are real. She stood in the middle of the workshop with the afternoon light on her face and didn't soften any of it. I also know that Briggs said our argument is solid. I know that Pruitt has been trying to get this water access for 3 years by a dozen different methods because he can't get it honestly. That means he's not certain either. He's not offering you this money because he's confident. He's offering it because he's trying to avoid the hearing. Sawyer looked at her. Something moved through his eyes. Not relief, not quite, but something in that direction. You're very sure, he said. I'm sure enough, she said. Are you? A long moment. The workshop held the smell of leather and oil and old wood and the particular scent of summer heat pressing in through the open door. If I fight this and lose, he said, I lose the ranch anyway, on worse terms. Yes. And you lose your job. Yes. You're telling me to fight it knowing that. Yes. She held his gaze without flinching. Because it's right. And because Pruitt doesn't get to just take things because he's decided he wants them. Sawyer was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the letter on the workbench. Then he picked it up and folded it and put it in the back pocket of his trousers. I'll write Briggs tonight, he said. Tell him we're going to the hearing. Good. He didn't move right away. He stood there with his hands at his sides and the workshop around him and Clara in front of him and the afternoon going golden outside. And something in his face was doing something she didn't look at too directly because she was afraid of what she'd see there if she did. Clara, he said. Yes. He looked at her with the look that had no name, and then he said, I don't know how to... He stopped. Tried again. I'm not good at... He stopped again. Pressed his mouth together. She waited. She gave him the time because he needed it, and she had it. I know, she said quietly, when it was clear the sentence was not going to complete itself. He exhaled, nodded, looked away. She went back to the house, yammed. The night before the hearing, Clara could not sleep. She lay on her cot in the room that had become over 4 months genuinely hers. The mirror straightened above the washstand, the peg rail with her things on it, the east-facing window that gave her the morning light. And she stared at the ceiling and turned the facts over in her mind the way you turn a stone, checking all the surfaces. The hearing was at 10 o'clock in the territorial court office in Millhaven. They would drive out before dawn. Briggs would meet them there. She had done everything she could do. The document summary, the easement analysis, the conversations about cattle and water and money and what mattered and why. She had given everything useful she had, and there was nothing left to give except the morning, and the morning would come whether she slept or not. She was nearly asleep finally when she heard a sound from the main room. Not alarming, just the creak of a floorboard that she knew as the third board from the foot of the stairs, which meant Sawyer was up. She heard him go to the kitchen, heard the quiet sound of the stove being opened and wood added, and after a moment the smell of coffee. She lay there for a minute. Then she got up, put her coat on over her nightclothes, and went to the kitchen. He was at the table with 2 cups already poured, which meant he'd heard her get up or he'd expected her to. She sat down across from him and took the cup. The stove was ticking quietly, warming up, and outside the window the night was very dark and very still, the stars hard and bright the way they got in the high country when the air was clear. Can't sleep, he said, not a question. No. Me either. They drank their coffee. The clock on the mantelpiece, which she'd repaired in May, the spring mechanism having given out, ticked steadily. I've been thinking, he said after a while, about the hearing. About after the hearing. He turned his cup, quarter turned back. Whatever happens, either way. She looked at him over the rim of her cup. If we win, he said carefully, like a man navigating terrain he's not certain about, the ranch is secure. The water rights are settled. Pruitt goes back to what he was doing before, which was accumulating things more quietly. He paused. The situation here, what I mean is, it would make sense for things to continue. As they are, she said. No. He looked at her directly. Not exactly as they are. The kitchen was very quiet. I'm not saying this right, he said. I know. She set her cup down. Say it anyway. He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough that she could hear the stove, the clock, her own heartbeat. I want you to stay, he said. Not as the housekeeper. I want... He stopped, started again. I want you to be here, permanently, as... I want you to be my wife, Clara. The word dropped into the room and sat there, and the night held still around it. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the look she had refused to name for 4 months, and now she could see it plain. It was not complicated. It was not calculated. It was simply the look of a man who had arrived, by the long and difficult route, at something honest. That's not pity, she said. No. His voice was quiet and certain. It's not pity. And it's not strategy. For the court. He held her gaze without flinching. No, I'm asking you because you are the... Because you've been... He pressed his mouth together, tried a third time because he was not a man who gave up on things. You've been more of a partner to me in 4 months than I've had in my whole life before. And I don't want that to be a job arrangement. I want it to be a choice. Your choice. Mine. He paused. I know I'm not easy. I know what this place is, what it costs, what the town says. I'm not asking you to pretend any of that is different. Clara looked at him. She looked at the kitchen. Her kitchen, practically. The stove she'd blackened, and the shelves she'd organized, and the curtain that a woman before her had made, and she had put back up because it deserved to be up. She looked at the man across the table from her, rough-edged and difficult, and more decent than Red Hollow had ever given him credit for, who had stood beside her in the yard when the town came calling, and had not once made her feel like a burden or a joke or a woman too large and plain and capable for anyone to value. I need to think, she said. Not no, not yes. The truth. He nodded once. All right. I'll give you my answer after the hearing. All right, he said again. They sat with their coffee until the sky outside the kitchen window began to go from black to the deep dark blue that comes before dawn, and neither of them said anything more, and neither of them needed to. They left for Millhaven before the sun was up, Doss driving a second wagon with the additional document copies, Charlie staying at the ranch to manage the animals. The drive was 2 hours on a good road that was decent in the cool of morning and would be punishing on the way back in the midday heat. Sawyer drove and Clara sat beside him on the bench with the leather satchel in her lap and the document she'd written, the plain language easement analysis, folded inside it, and they watched the country go from dark to gray to the first pale light of morning without talking much. Once, on a stretch of straight road where the ridge came into view on the east, he said, "Whatever happens today, I want you to know that I meant what I said last night." "I know," she said. "I don't say things I don't mean." "I know that too." He drove. The horse moved at a steady pace. The satchel was solid and real in her lap. "Sawyer," she said, after another mile. "Yes." She looked at the road ahead. "I know what my answer is." He didn't speak right away. She could feel him beside her, very still. "And," he said. "And I'll tell you after the hearing," she said. "Like I said." A pause. "Clara, if I tell you now, you'll spend the whole hearing not listening to Briggs." The pause stretched. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. The real smile. The full one. Not the almost smile, the actual thing, which was rarer than water in a dry July and worth considerably more. It changed his whole face, and it lasted several seconds before he put it away again. "Fair enough," he said. She looked back at the road and the morning light coming up over the ridge, and thought that whatever happened in that courtroom, and she did not know what would happen, 60-40 was not a certainty. Nothing in this territory was a certainty. She already knew what she wanted. She had known it for longer than she'd admitted. She simply had not been ready to say so. She was ready now. The wagon rolled into Millhaven as the courthouse bell struck 8, and Harlan Briggs was waiting on the steps with his document case and his wire-rimmed spectacles, and the expression of a man who had prepared as well as preparation allowed. "Ready?" he said. Sawyer looked at Clara. She looked at him. "Yes," they said at the same time, and went up the steps. The territorial court office in Mill Haven was not an impressive room. It was functional in the way that frontier justice tended to be functional. A large rectangular space with high windows that let in light without inviting distraction. 2 long tables facing a raised platform where Judge Karn would sit. Benches along the back wall for observers. The floor was swept but not finished. The walls were plain plank. There was a water pitcher on each table and a clock on the wall above the judge's platform that ticked with the authority of something that did not care about anyone's anxiety. Briggs had them seated at the left table by 9:15, the documents arranged in the order he'd specified, a copy of Clara's easement summary in front of each of them. Pruitt's legal team occupied the right table. 2 men from Millhaven, both in proper suits, both carrying the particular ease of lawyers who were accustomed to winning on the strength of their clients' resources. Pruitt himself sat in the observer's bench behind them, large and red-faced and composed. He looked at Sawyer when they came in. He did not look at Clara, which was its own kind of statement. Clara sat beside Sawyer and put the leather satchel on the floor at her feet, and folded her hands on the table and breathed slowly. She had been in enough difficult situations in her life to know that the ones you couldn't do anything about were better endured with a still body and a working mind, because the energy you spent on visible anxiety was energy you needed for thinking. Briggs leaned over and said quietly, "The judge is running on time today." "That's good. It means he's not in a mood to be dragged around." "What does that mean for us?" Sawyer said. "It means keep your answers to what's asked. Don't volunteer. Let me do the talking." He glanced at Clara. "Your summary is strong. If Carney reads it before he comes in, we're in good shape." "Did he read it?" Clara asked. "I sent it to his clerk 2 days ago. Whether he read it—" Briggs adjusted his spectacles. "We'll know soon enough." Judge Karn came in at exactly 10 o'clock, which was the first thing Clara learned about him. He was a man in his late 50s, spare and angular, with close-cropped gray hair and eyes that moved fast and deliberately over the room when he sat down. The eyes of someone cataloging everything and deciding what was relevant before anyone had opened their mouth. He looked at the 2 tables. He looked at the observer's bench. He looked at the documents in front of him for a moment, and then he looked up. "This is the matter of the Pruitt Land and Water Company versus Kane Property, Northeast Easement, Access Restriction Motion," he said. His voice was dry and precise, like a man reading a parts list. "I've reviewed the filings from both parties and the supplementary analysis submitted by the defendant 4 days ago." He paused, and something in the pause made Briggs sit slightly straighter. "I have questions for both sides before we proceed. We'll start with the plaintiff." What followed was 2 hours that Clara experienced in the particular way of high-stakes waiting. Alternately very fast and very slow, certain passages sharp and clear, and others blurring into a general tension that sat behind her sternum and did not move. Pruitt's lawyers were good. They were measured, professional, and they had built their argument carefully. Historical water use patterns, the ambiguity of the easement language, the precedent of adjacent property rights in the territory. They spoke with the confidence of men who had done this before and expected to do it again. Then Carney turned to Briggs. Briggs stood up with the unhurried manner of a man who understood that nervousness was a disadvantage and had decided some years ago not to have any. He walked Carney through the easement clause language with the same careful attention that Clara had given it 6 weeks ago in a kitchen in the Broke Spur. And Clara sat at the table and watched the judge's face and tried to read it and largely couldn't, because Carney was a man who had spent decades not letting his face be read. But he asked questions. He asked good questions, pointed and specific, the questions of someone who had already read everything and was testing the arguments rather than learning from them. When he asked about the access rights language specifically, the distinction between access and exclusive access that Clara's summary had centered on, Briggs cited the summary directly, and Carney looked down at the document in front of him and was quiet for a moment. "The supplementary analysis," Carney said. "Who prepared it?" Briggs said, "Miss Clara Whitmore, who serves as the defendant's household manager and who reviewed the deed documents at the defendant's request." Carney looked up. He looked for the first time directly at Clara. She met his eyes without looking away. "Not a lawyer," Carn said. "No, Your Honor," Clara said. "You read documents." I read carefully, she said, which was what she'd told Briggs, which was the truth. Carney looked at her for a moment with those fast, deliberate eyes. Then he looked back at the document. The distinction she's drawn is correct, he said, to no one in particular, in the tone of a man confirming something he'd already decided. Access is not exclusive access. That's plain language. Pruitt's lead lawyer stood up. Your Honor, the historical use. Sit down, Mr. Garrett, Carn said without looking up. I've read your brief on historical use. I have questions about it. And he asked those questions, and the questions were not comfortable ones for Garrett to answer, and the next 40 minutes went the way they went. Clara watched and held very still and did not let herself hope too directly, because hope in a courtroom before the decision was a distraction and she couldn't afford it. At 12:30, Carney called a 30-minute recess. In the hallway outside, Briggs said quietly, He's writing the decision in his head, I can tell. Which direction? Sawyer said. I think ours. Briggs adjusted his spectacles. I think. Sawyer looked at Clara. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing useful to say. They drank water from a pitcher in the hallway and stood near the window and watched Millhaven go about its noon business in the street below. And Clara thought about the broke spur and the east-facing window in her room and the chickens and Doss's daughter and the blue curtain that was back where it belonged. And she thought that whatever happened in the next 30 minutes, those things had been real. They had actually happened. Nobody could rule against that. Carney came back at 1 o'clock and delivered his decision in 11 minutes, which Briggs told her afterward was fast for him, which meant he'd made up his mind before the recess. The temporary access restriction motion was denied. The easement language did not support an exclusivity claim on historical use grounds alone. The broader property claim would proceed to a full hearing in September, but the immediate restriction, the one that would have cost Sawyer the North Quarter water access through the dry summer, was refused. Pruitt's lead lawyer asked for clarification on 2 points. Carney gave it in the same dry, precise voice and then adjourned. The room shifted. Clara heard Pruitt stand up behind her, heard the particular sound of a large man gathering himself after a setback, the creak of the bench, the deliberate pace of boots on the floor. He walked out without speaking to anyone. Briggs was already reorganizing his documents with the efficient movements of a man for whom this was Tuesday. We have September to prepare for, he said. The broader claim is still open, but today was important. He can't touch the water this summer. September, Sawyer said. We'll be ready. The argument we made today is the same argument for September, just more fully developed. And Briggs looked at Clara over his spectacles. I'd like to formally retain Miss Whitmore's document analysis services for the September preparation, if she's available. Clara blinked. I'm not a lawyer. No, Briggs said. But you think like one, and you charge considerably less. He said this without a smile, in the tone of a practical man making a practical observation. Think about it. He packed his case and went to speak to the clerk, and Sawyer and Clara were left standing at the empty table in the emptying room, the clock above the judge's platform still ticking with its complete indifference to what had just happened. Sawyer looked at the table. Then he looked at her. Well, he said. Well, she said. He let out a breath, long, controlled, the breath of a man who has been holding something together for hours and is now, cautiously, allowing himself not to. You said you'd give me an answer after the hearing, he said. The room was nearly empty now. The last of the clerks were gathering papers at the far end. The afternoon light came through the high windows in long, dusty slants. Clara looked at Sawyer Kane. She looked at the man who had opened his door to a woman the town sent as a joke and said, "Come in," and who had never once, in 4 months, made her feel like less than what she was. Who had stood beside her in his own yard while the town arrived to collect her and had not moved an inch backward. Who had asked her, at a kitchen table at 2 a.m. with coffee between them, not because it was convenient or strategic or because she'd transformed herself into something the world approved of, but because she'd shown up to his life as her actual self, and that had turned out to be enough. More than enough. It had turned out to be the thing. Yes, she said. My answer is yes. He looked at her for a moment with the full version of the look she'd been refusing to name, and now she had a name for it, and the name was simple. It was the look of a man who had stopped expecting to be met and had just been met. He reached across the space between them and took her hand, not dramatically, not with ceremony, just a hand closing around her hand, rough-palmed and certain, and held it for a moment, and that was that. They were married 3 weeks later in Carver's Ridge, because neither of them wanted to do it in Red Hollow. And Carver's Ridge was where Briggs was, and Briggs turned out to know the justice of the peace personally. It was a plain ceremony in a plain office on a Wednesday afternoon, Doss and Charlie as witnesses, nobody else. Doss cried, which surprised everyone, including Doss. Charlie shook Sawyer's hand with the solemnity of a young man who understood that something significant had happened and wanted to register that he understood it. Briggs, who had come along without being exactly invited, bought everyone coffee afterward at the hotel dining room and said it was the most useful merger of interests he'd witnessed in 5 years of practice, which was, for Harlan Briggs, an extravagant compliment. Clara wore her best dress, which was not a wedding dress but was clean and pressed, and was hers, and she stood in the justice's office and said the words she was asked to say, and meant all of them. And when it was done, she was Clara Kane, and the broke spur was as much hers as it was his, in all the ways that mattered practically, and in the ways that mattered beyond practically. They drove back to the ranch in the afternoon, the 4 of them in the wagon, and the valley spread out below the ridge in the long summer light, green going gold in the high places, the creek, their creek, the water rights intact and defended, catching the sun in the low ground. "You know the town's going to have opinions," Sawyer said, at some point on the road back. "The town always has opinions," Clara said. "This time they're going to be worse. For about 2 weeks," she said. "And then something else will happen and they'll move on." He looked at her sideways. "How are you so sure?" "Because that's how people are. The thing they're outraged about today is somebody else's story tomorrow." She watched the road. "Besides, half of them are already reconsidering. Hattie came around months ago. Louisa practically apologized. People adjust when they see that the thing they were certain about turned out to be wrong. Pruitt won't adjust. Pruitt has September to think about." She paused. "And Briggs is very good." Sawyer drove without saying anything for a stretch of road that took them past the burned-out tree that marked the halfway point, the old lightning-strike oak that had been there as long as anyone could remember, the skeleton of it still standing, still marking distance. "You're going to help Briggs with the September preparation," he said. Not a question. "If you don't mind." "I don't mind." A pause. "You know you don't have to ask." She looked at him. "I know. I asked anyway." "Why?" "Because it's your ranch. It's your legal case. It matters to be asked and not just assumed." He was quiet for a moment. "It's our ranch," he said. "I know that too." She looked back at the road. "I still asked." He shook his head slightly, the motion of a man who has encountered a principle he disagrees with on the surface and finds himself agreeing with underneath. Doss, in the wagon bed behind them with Charlie, made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. "Something funny, Doss," Sawyer said. "No, sir," Doss said, in the voice of a man who thought, "Yes, sir." Neat. September came, and the hearing came with it, and it was longer and more involved than August had been. 3 days in the Mill Haven court, with more witnesses and more documents, and more of the careful back and forth of opposing legal arguments. Clara had spent 6 weeks helping Briggs prepare, going through the territorial land records, cross-referencing the easement language with adjacent property precedents, building the kind of documented argument that was hard to argue with because it was grounded in specifics rather than interpretation. She sat at the table beside Sawyer all 3 days. She was not a party to the case, and she was not a lawyer, and she did not speak except when Briggs asked her a direct question, which he did twice, both times about specific document details that she answered precisely and without elaboration. Pruitt's team was better prepared for September than they'd been for August. They had clearly spent the intervening weeks working on the historical use argument, shoring up its weaknesses, bringing in a surveyor's testimony about the tributary and the creek flow. It was a stronger case than August's. Clara had expected it to be. But Briggs had spent those same weeks making the counterargument tighter, and the documents Clara had pulled from the territorial records included 2 easement precedents from adjacent counties that Pruitt's team had apparently not found. And when Carney read them during the second day's recess, the quality of his questions in the afternoon session shifted in a way that Briggs, sitting next to Clara, recognized with a slight relaxation of his shoulders. The decision came on the 4th day, Carney having taken one additional day to write it up properly. It was 22 pages. Briggs read it in the courthouse hallway in 11 minutes, while Sawyer stood with his arms crossed, and Clara sat on the bench with her hands folded and watched a sparrow that had gotten into the hallway navigate its way toward the far window with the determined persistence of something that didn't know it was supposed to be lost. Briggs lowered the document. "We won," he said. The easement was confirmed non-exclusive. Pruitt's water restriction claim was dismissed. The creek access to the Broke Spur's north quarter was permanently established in Sawyer Kane's favor, and the decision included a finding that Pruitt's historical use argument had been made in bad faith, which was the kind of legal language that had costs beyond the immediate case. Sawyer looked at the document for a long moment. Then he looked at Clara. She was already looking at him. 22 pages, she said. Yes. Briggs earned his fee. He did. Sawyer was quiet for a moment. So did you. I'm not a lawyer, she said, for the second time in this building. No, Sawyer said. You're something more useful. Briggs, folding the decision back into its envelope, made a sound of agreement that he would have denied making if asked. What happened to Gerald Pruitt afterward was not a sudden collapse. Things in the territory didn't work that way, and men with money and land had more cushion than most against their own bad judgment. But the bad faith finding in the September decision followed him. Two of the smaller ranchers whose water rights he'd been working on acquiring quietly came to hear about it, and they declined to sell. The tributary dam on his eastern property became the subject of its own filing, brought by two upstream neighbors who had been watching the Broke Spur case and decided that watching was no longer sufficient. Holcomb distanced himself with the efficiency of a man who had always been more interested in being on the winning side than in loyalty to any particular winner. Pruitt didn't leave the valley. Men like Pruitt rarely left, but the shape of what he could do there changed, and he knew it, and eventually he stopped sending men to the Broke Spur's gate with offers about water rights. The town of Red Hollow, because this is where things always circle back to in a valley this size, took several months to complete its adjustment. Clara had been right that it would adjust. She had perhaps underestimated how interesting the adjustment would be to observe. Vera Fitch came to the ranch in October with a jar of preserved pears and an expression of a woman who was going to do a thing with dignity or not at all. Clara let her in, set the kettle on, and sat across the kitchen table from her and waited. I was wrong, Vera said. About you. About the situation. She set the jar of pears on the table between them with the deliberateness of a peace offering being formally tendered. I was also used, which I don't appreciate, and I should have seen it sooner. You weren't the only one, Clara said. That doesn't make me feel better. It's not supposed to, it's just true. Clara poured the tea. Pruitt is good at making people feel like they're acting on their own values when they're actually acting on his interests. It's how men like him operate. Vera looked at the tea. You knew that. I grew up watching it happen to my father, Clara said. Different man, smaller scale, same mechanism. Vera was quiet for a moment. You're not going to make this gracious, are you? I'm having tea with you, Clara said. That's as gracious as I know how to be right now. Vera looked at her, and something in her face did what Louisa's face had done in the post office doorway. Went complicated, went honest, went past the version of itself that was performing and landed somewhere more real. Fair enough, she said. They drank their tea, and it was not comfortable exactly, but it was real. And real was what Clara had always preferred over comfortable anyway. Louisa Fitch came separately, without the preserved pears and without the formal dignity, and she came not to the ranch but to Clara on a supply run in Red Hollow, catching her outside Gruber's store on a Tuesday morning in November. I wanted to say it properly, Louisa said, without preamble, which Clara respected. What I did in March, sending you out there the way we did, thinking it was... She stopped. We thought it was funny. I thought it was funny. I was wrong, and I was unkind, and the way it turned out doesn't change the fact that the intention was unkind. Clara looked at her. The morning was cold, breath visible in the air, the street mostly empty. Why does it matter to you to say it? Clara asked. She was genuinely curious. Louisa considered the question, which Clara respected too. Because I have to live here, with myself and with the version of myself that did that. She paused. And because you're here now, you and Sawyer Kane, And you won a legal case that the whole valley is talking about. And I'd rather have said what I'm saying now, while it still costs me something, than wait until it costs me nothing and have it mean nothing." Clara was quiet for a moment. The cold moved through the street. "All right," she said. "All right," Louisa repeated, uncertain. "It's accepted," Clara said. "Don't make me say it twice." Something in Louisa's face released, and she nodded, and they went their separate ways up the street. And that was that. And it was enough. Ciao. The Broke Spur going into its first winter under the Kane marriage was a different place from the one Clara had ridden up to on Old Pete on a cold March morning. Different in the visible ways. The house properly maintained now, a new south-facing window in the main room that let afternoon light in where there had been none, the yard in order, the woodpile built up substantial and square against the cold. Different in the less visible ways that were harder to describe, but that Doss noticed and Charlie noticed, and anyone who had known the place before would have noticed. The quality of the quiet inside it, which was no longer the quiet of a man enduring his own solitude, but the quiet of two people who had learned each other's silences and could exist in them without unease. Sawyer did not become a different man. Clara had not wanted him to, and would not have known what to do with him if he had. He was still difficult in the specific ways he had always been difficult. Still clipped when he was overwhelmed, still prone to carrying problems in silence longer than was useful, still capable of going half a day without saying more than functional sentences when something had gotten under his skin. He still moved through a room like a man calculating the fastest route to the door. But the door, she had noticed, was staying closed more often than it used to. She was not without her own difficulties. She had a stubborn streak that even she would admit was occasionally counterproductive. She tended to form opinions quickly and revise them slowly, which was not always the most efficient way to be wrong. She had the habit, developed over years of surviving on her own judgment, of not asking for help with things, until she'd already exhausted herself trying to manage them alone. And Sawyer had to learn to watch for this, and she had to learn to let him. These were the actual textures of the thing, not the story the town told about them, which, by winter, had moved several degrees toward the romantic, the way small towns rewrite the histories of the people they once dismissed, once those people turn out to be interesting. But the daily, imperfect, specific work of two people building a life in the same space. There were arguments. Not many, but real ones, about real things. Money, twice. The cattle management approach, once, which Doss eventually settled by pointing out that they were both right about different parts of the problem, which was embarrassing for both of them. The east bedroom, which Sawyer had left unused and Clara wanted to convert to a proper workroom. And Sawyer had a feeling about that she didn't understand until he told her, finally, that it had been his daughter's room, in the time before, in the marriage that had ended. She hadn't known there had been a child. She sat with that for a long time. He sat with having told her. "What happened?" she asked, when enough time had passed. "She died," he said, "at 18 months, fever." He said it in the voice of a man who has decided to say the true thing and will not be able to say it a second time. "My wife left 6 months after. She couldn't be here anymore. I understood it. I didn't blame her." He was quiet. "I wasn't easy to be with after." Clara did not say she was sorry, because he knew she was sorry, and sorry was too small a word for this, and she did not reach for something comforting to say because there was nothing comforting to say. And she did not try to make it better because it was not a thing that got better. It was a thing that got carried. She moved her chair around the table and sat beside him instead of across from him. And he did not look at her, but after a moment his hand found hers on the table and held it. "The room," she said, after a while, "can stay as it is. I'll find another place for the workroom." "The front room has the light," he said. "Yes." "You could use that." "Yes," she said. "I could." They sat there until the lamp burned low, and neither of them said anything more about it, and they did not need to. The September ruling's bad faith finding came back around in the spring, as these things do in a territory where legal precedent moves slowly, but moves. The upstream neighbors filing against Pruitt's dam resulted in a mediated agreement that required him to modify the structure at his own considerable expense, restoring a portion of the natural flow to the creek system. It was not a complete restoration, and it was not a complete victory for anyone, But it meant the Broke Spur's North Quarter water situation improved over the following summer, and the cattle numbers came back up, and the grazing was better than it had been in 3 years. Briggs came out to the ranch that summer, not on legal business, but because Clara had sent him a letter about an easement situation that a neighboring small rancher, a woman named Patton, recently widowed, who ran 40 head on the Broke Spur's southwest border, was being pressured into settling unfavorably. Briggs read the situation, agreed with Clara's reading, and took the case. He won it in 4 weeks without going to court, because the party pressuring misses. Patton had evidently not anticipated encountering a lawyer who already understood all the arguments. Mrs. Patton paid Briggs what she could, which was not much, and brought Clara 3 jars of her apple preserve by way of additional thanks. Clara accepted both the jars and the implicit understanding that had formed, that the Broke Spur was a place where people in the valley's southwest corner could bring a problem and find something useful. This had not been a plan. It had not been Sawyer's plan or Clara's plan or anyone's plan. It had simply grown from the specific combination of what they each knew how to do and what the community around them needed. The way things grow when the conditions are right and someone bothers to pay attention. Doss stayed. Charlie stayed through the following year and then moved on, as young men do, heading north toward new country, and they replaced him with a young woman named Rose, who had grown up on a ranch 3 valleys over and could fix a fence line faster than either of the men she'd been compared to at the hiring, which was how she got the job. Sawyer did not become comfortable in town exactly, but he came in more often, and he said more than the minimum when he did, and there were people in Red Hollow who came to know him as something other than the man you crossed the street to avoid. Not everyone. You cannot change everyone's mind about you, and Clara had learned long ago that trying to was a fool's errand. But enough. Hattie Drummond, in one of the last conversations Clara had with her before Hattie's health declined, said, "I told you he was decent." "You told me he was fair," Clara corrected. "Same thing." "They're not quite." Hattie made the sound of a woman who was not going to agree but was too tired to argue. "You were always going to be fine, you know," she said. "I knew that when I cut your hours. I felt bad about it." "You should have felt bad about it," Clara said. "I did." Hattie looked out the boarding house window at the street, at Red Hollow going about its business in the afternoon. "You just needed someone to see it before you did." "I saw it," Clara said. "I just needed somewhere to put it." Hattie looked at her. "The ranch." "The ranch," Clara agreed. "Was. There's a particular thing that the frontier teaches you, if you stay long enough and pay enough attention to learn it. It is not the thing that people in comfortable places like to believe the frontier teaches. Not the myth of the self-made individual, the solitary hero who builds something from nothing through pure will. That is a story people tell because it is simpler than the truth, and because it flatters the idea that what a person achieves is entirely their own. The actual thing the frontier teaches is that survival is not a solo act, that the ranch does not run on one person's effort, that the water rights mean nothing if the people upstream are not constrained by the same law you are, that the house is a house, and not just 4 walls because someone decided it was worth maintaining, and someone else decided it was worth coming home to, and someone else decided it was worth defending. Clara Kane understood this in her bones because she had lived it. She had arrived at the Broke Spur with nothing but her 2 changes of work clothes and a mending kit, and the knowledge, carried so long it had become structural, that she was not the kind of woman other people chose to value. She had not arrived transformed. She had arrived as herself, capable and stubborn and plain-spoken and tired, and more competent than anyone had given her credit for, which was not a talent, but simply the result of years of practice at doing what needed doing without anyone telling her she had done it well. What she found at the Broke Spur was not rescue. She had not needed rescuing. What she found was a place where her actual self, not the managed, smaller version she deployed in Red Hollow's social machinery, but the full version, the one with opinions about easement law and bread making and the proper care of an iron stove, was not only sufficient, but necessary. That was the thing. That was the thing that nobody in Red Hollow had given her, that the Broke Spur had, that Sawyer Kane had in his particular difficult way. Not approval, not rescue, necessity. The sense that the specific person she actually was mattered to the specific situation she was in. It seems like a small thing until you have gone without it for 8 years. Then it is not a small thing at all. By the time the valley's southwest corner had begun to think of the Kane Ranch as a fixed point, a place of competence and fair dealing, a household that had earned what it had through specific, documented, unglamorous effort, Clara had been at the Broke Spur for 3 years. The woman who had been sent there as a joke was unrecognizable in the woman who managed the household accounts, assisted Briggs on 3 additional cases, kept the range records that documented the recovery of the North Quarter grazing, and made, by common agreement, the best apple cake within 40 miles. The joke, such as it had been, was long over. What remained was not a story about triumph, exactly. Life on the Broke Spur was not triumphant in the way that stories sometimes made the frontier sound. No single moment of vindication, no scene in which all the people who had been wrong stood in a row and acknowledged it while the light came down in golden rays. What remained was more ordinary and more durable than that. It was the creek running clear through the North Quarter in the second summer after the September ruling. It was Doss at the table with his daughter on a Sunday afternoon. The girl, 8 years old now, then 9, then 10, eating the cake that Clara made for her every birthday. It was Sawyer, in the evenings, at the kitchen table across from Clara, the lamp between them and the account ledger open, going through numbers that were no longer frightening in the way they had been, talking through problems that were the good kind of problems, the kind that meant the thing was growing. It was Rose fixing the east fence at 6 in the morning while the frost was still on the grass, singing something under her breath in the particular unselfconscious way of someone who doesn't realize they're happy and doesn't need to. It was the front room of the Broke Spur house, cleared and reorganized, where Clara worked in the mornings on documents and correspondence and the occasional letter for a neighbor who needed something put down in plain language. The room had good light, as Sawyer had said, the east window and the south window both, and the morning came through them clean and clear and fell across the work table where she sat. And she sat in it and worked, and the work was useful and the day was hers. And that was enough, more than enough. It was everything. The woman Red Hollow had sent to Sawyer Kane's door as a joke became, in the end, exactly what she had always been. A person of considerable capability and ordinary appearance who needed, like all people of considerable capability and ordinary appearance, exactly one thing before any of it could matter. She needed to be somewhere that had room for her. She found it. She fought for it. She kept it. The frontier offered no guarantees about any of this, and never had, and anyone who told you otherwise was selling something. But it offered the chance, which was all it had ever owed anyone, and Clara Whitmore Kane had taken that chance and worked it into something real. In the end, that was the whole story, and it was enough of a story for any life.